Hello, happy Sunday afternoon on the beautiful weather. My name's Evan Papa George. I'm a student at Stevens Institute of Technology, and I will be introducing our speaker today. Today we have Dr. Lindsey Swindall will be delivering our address for the 125th birthday of Paul Robeson. Professor Swindall holds a doctorate in African American Studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She has written 2 books on Robeson, The Politics of Paul Robeson's Othello and Paul Robeson, A Life of Activism and Art. Her book, The Path to the Greater, Freer, Truer World, examines 2 organizations with which Robeson was involved, the Congress on African American Affairs and the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Working with actor Grant Cooper, Professor Swindall has also created a dramatic program on Robeson's life for middle and high schools as well as colleges. She currently teaches in the College of Arts and Letters, soon to be the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, at Stevens Institute of Technology here in Hoboken, New Jersey, of which I am a student of hers. So please welcome Dr. Lindsey Swindall.
All right, good afternoon. Thanks so much, Evan. Thanks to the museum for hosting this today. I'm really excited to be marking Paul Robeson's 125th anniversary here. And if you're interested in a book by chance, see the handsome fellow in this lovely Paul Robeson jacket up here. All right, let's go ahead and dive right in. So I just wanted to note that my talk today is dedicated to the memory of John H. Bracey Jr., who I'm not going to say much about because I'll get upset, but he was a great mentor of mine, and he actually worked with me on my dissertation project, which became my first book about Paul Robeson, and he just passed away in February, so I'm dedicating this to him. Come on through. And I also wanted to just note that today's Shakespeare's birthday, so happy birthday to Shakespeare. Paul Robeson's birthday is actually the 9th, but if you can't get an event on Paul Robeson's birthday, I think Shakespeare's birthday is probably the next best thing, because Robeson was, of course, well known for his 3 portrayals of Shakespeare's Othello. Actually, this is just a cheap way for me to also note my book on Robeson's Othello performances. So, hi, Joyce. All right, so I thought we would just kind of start by thinking a little bit about what things were like in the United States when Paul Robeson was born. So he was born in 1898. And actually, on the day that he was born, April 9th, there was a delegation of activists who met with President McKinley to talk about the problem of lynching across the country. And that delegation included famous activist Ida B. Wells. They were unsuccessful, but I think it's a really cool connection that Robeson, who would himself become an anti-lynching advocate, was born on the day when there was this delegation meeting the president. Also around this time, this was right around the time that the war against Spain started. So the sinking of the battleship Maine, which you see in the background there of the image. So this was a time when there was a lot of, kind of hype about getting the war started. There was a lot of imperialist spirit in the United States at this time. So it was a really kind of tumultuous moment. This is also right as Europe was carving up Africa into colonies. The infamous Berlin Conference was in the 1880s, where they carved up large portions of Africa into colonies. And that was still going on as Robeson was born. Immigration into the United States was very steady, and a lot of these immigrants were taking manufacturing jobs. Meanwhile, the Gilded Age magnates who owned the factories were reaping tremendous profits from this big sort of explosion of industrialization that was happening in the United States. This was just a couple of years removed from the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson decision of the Supreme Court, which basically gave sanction to segregation law and segregation tradition throughout the country. So it said that separate but equal accommodations could be constitutional. And that was something that was a really devastating loss for African Americans in particular. And then finally, Frederick Douglass had just passed away in 1895. And so it was kind of an era when new leadership in the African American community was emerging. So I mentioned all of these things to basically say that all of these areas were very active for Robeson in his lifetime. So in his lifetime, he would invest huge amounts of time and energy into speaking out against imperialism and the colonialism in Africa. He would also speak out for workers' rights and more equitable wages. And really, he wanted to see the capitalist system turn into something that was going to be more equal for especially the producing classes in the United States. And of course, he took a strong stand against segregation throughout his lifetime. So he would really become one of the emergent leadership in the early 20th century. All right, so I wanted to frame this talk today not as a summation of Paul Robeson's life, but if you're not familiar with his life, there's a lot of great literature out there, including my book, of course. But I wanted to focus on this notion of Renaissance. Why? Because it's something that I've been thinking about. We often hear the idea of Renaissance being used to describe Robeson. He's often called the Renaissance man because he was so talented in so many different areas. But I wanted to explore Renaissance in kind of a different way, even though it's applicable in a number of ways. So we could think of this idea of rebirth if we look at the rebirth of interest in Robeson that's happened in recent years. So I've been studying and writing about Robeson for just over 20 years. When I started that journey, it was very difficult to find a lot of source material. These days, that's completely changed. It's really, really opened up. And there's tons of new books. There are new plays and performances, historical sites, articles. I mean, there's really a rebirth of work on him, which is very exciting to see. These are just a couple of examples of that. There's a new graphic biography of Robeson here on the left that was just published by Rutgers Press. And on the right is a young adult biography of Robeson written by Martin Duberman, who was one of the more important biographers of Robeson. His biography came out in '89, and it was really the first post-Cold War study of Robeson that kind of began this long journey of opening up more scholarly work on Robeson. So we could think of rebirth or Renaissance as a re-looking at his life and work. We could also conceptualize Renaissance in the sense that he was considered a Renaissance man in a couple of ways. So in one way, we could think of him as being a Renaissance man because he was incredibly well-rounded. He had so many different skills and talents that he cultivated. He was a scholar, an athlete, an actor, an activist. But we can also think of Robeson as a Renaissance man in the sense that he was a really important person during the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. And so that was a time when he was really coming into his own as a performer, and he was very much a part of this artistic blossoming that was happening in the New York neighborhood of Harlem in the 1920s. But we're not going to talk about any of those. We're going to talk about rebirth or Renaissance in the sense of being reborn in times of crisis. And this is something that's been on my mind because obviously we are today living through very tumultuous times, right? Politically, obviously, there's a lot going on. And also just having lived through this global pandemic, we had a lot of time to sit around and think about things. So this was one of the things that I was thinking about. You know, if we're going to look at historical figures like Robeson, you know, I think it's important to think about how we can sort of use their stories as a way to inform us or help us to think about our own times, or even maybe help us to think about how we might respond to our own times of crisis. So Robeson lived through some of the most difficult moments of the 20th century. He lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and probably most impactful to him in his career was the post-World War II anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s. And because he had been actively aligned with a lot of left-wing groups, that really came to bear on him in tremendous ways in terms of how it impacted his life and his work and ultimately his health as well. But even living through these very tumultuous times, I'm going to point to a few key moments where he sort of has to be reborn in a sense. He confronts particular issues and has to kind of change course or change direction or figure out a way to respond to this. And to me, this is a really interesting way to look at Robeson's life, because maybe it will inspire us to kind of consider how, we're impacted by a lot of the issues of the day today. How will we respond to those? How might we redirect our course or, find a way to grow our own skills and capabilities to respond to the issues of our time? And to me, this is a really kind of inspiring way to think about, those people in history whom we tend to look up to. So we're going to start with the idea of capability. So this image is of Robeson's graduating class from Columbia Law in 1923. Most people don't realize that he had a law degree because he never really practiced with it. Coming out of Columbia Law, he had a really difficult time finding a job, and he was for a short time employed by a law firm in Manhattan until a secretary refused to take dictation with him because he was African American. And he was sort of told by the leadership of the firm, this probably really isn't going to work out. So at that moment, he had to kind of decide, right? I mean, he had been working extraordinarily hard to get through law school. He was going to law school. In order to pay for law school, he was playing football in the early iteration of the professional football leagues, which were very rough and tumble, if you've ever seen any of the photos from that. So all weekend he would be traveling to play football. Also, he was acting in some, theatrical productions around the city. Basically, all of this was to help make money so that he could pursue his law degree. So he's gone through all of this. He's, got this tremendous work ethic. He's done all of this. He gets to the point where he can practice law, and he runs right into what W.E.B. Du Bois would call the color bar, right? So what does he do at that moment? What he ends up doing is kind of changing course and developing his capabilities in this whole other arena. And that's what he's alluding to in this quote here. So he noted in 1924, you see, I started out to be a lawyer, but I think I'm a good enough actor. I can go pretty far. Now, this is interesting because he didn't often talk publicly about the fact that he had started out as a lawyer on that path. Most people just associate him as a tremendously successful actor and singer, right? But that was actually a kind of change in his course. And he had to really dig in and say, okay, well, now I'm going to pursue this as a career, right? And, kind of turn himself into something that he wasn't necessarily planning to be. Of course, he did it in an extraordinary way and had extraordinary success. This statement is incredibly humble, right? Considering what he achieves as an actor in both film and theater. But I think it's interesting to think about this obviously we might not have the same extent of talent as somebody like Robeson, but I think often we're called upon in times of crisis or times of stress or times when we encounter obstacles to, explore parts of ourselves that we might not have previously, and to really grow those capabilities in ways that push us in a new direction. And I think that's something that's especially inspiring about his story. So can anybody find him in the image up there? You've been looking at it for a few minutes. On the left-hand side, kind of hidden, the one African-American face there. You got it? So now we're going to talk about the idea of responsibility. So with responsibility, what I see happening at another pivotal moment in his career is another kind of shift in his course or his path. So here's the context. It's 1942. It's a time when Robeson has grown tremendously as an actor in film. From the late 20s through the 1930s, he makes a number of films. He's become very successful as a film star. Some film historians argue that he was probably one of the most recognizable celebrity names in the country at this time. He's also a very successful singer, singing mostly African-American spirituals and other folk songs. If you're interested in the spirituals, go to the museum's website, and I did a talk on the spirituals a couple years ago. So he's very well known, very successful, both financially and in terms of kind of building this career in the arts. But in 1942, he had been in a film called Tales of Manhattan, and the film is kind of a slight sort of comedy about this coat, and you see the coat in the image there. This coat sort of drifts from place to place, and there's little vignettes around the people who stumble upon this coat and, how it changes their lives. So Paul Robeson and Ethel Waters are sharecroppers who stumble upon the coat, and when they find it, the pockets are stuffed with money. And so it's kind of like, this is going to change their lives, right? But what their vignette turns into is very much almost like a caricature of African-American life in the South, and very serious issues like sharecropping and poverty, issues that were dear to Robeson's life because he had relatives who were sharecroppers. And the African-American press in particular came down really hard on him when this film came out, because they said, like, what is he doing? This is somebody that we really respect as trying to bring dignity to African and African-American culture. And doing that in the film industry had always been a real challenge for him, because he often set out in a film project to portray something like African culture, but then it would turn out to be very much a kind of, white imperialist gaze on these ideas. And so he was always kind of struggling to find work that he felt really portrayed people and themes of African descent with dignity. And so when the Black press especially comes down on him after this film, he sort of says, okay, he has a press conference, and he says at that press conference that he would be leaving Hollywood until they found a way to portray African Americans other than the usual, quote, plantation hallelujah shouters. Well, he never returns to film because that never happened in his lifetime. Arguably, has it happened now, right? But to me, this is a really eye-opening moment. Like, how many people who are achieving celebrity, who are making lots of money, who are, in the public eye in this kind of way, kind of stop and take responsibility like that and say, you know what, you're right. This film was not portraying African Americans in a dignified way. As a result, I'm not going to act in film anymore, right? And he leaves film completely. After this, he'll portray Othello on stage, on Broadway, and then again in London. But his acting career is, for the most part, very much on the wane after this. And he really focuses more on his singing career because he felt that in his singing career, he could have control of the content and he could speak to that content how he wanted to. So again, I think this notion of responsibility is one that is interesting to ponder for us in our own times, and sort of thinking about, when are those moments when we need to pause and take responsibility for something and maybe even move forward in a new direction, even if that's difficult, even if you're giving up a lot of money or fame or something like that. If it's the right thing to do, then it's something that's the right thing to do. The third thing I want to talk about is intentionality. So through the 40s and the 50s, I see Robeson as becoming increasingly intentional about his career. And what I mean by intentional is making decisions like that one to leave Hollywood, right? To focus on his singing career because the content is more under his control. Well, by the late 40s and into the early 1950s, as the country is really shifting in its politics in the post-World War II era, anti-communism is really at its height, and it's coming to bear on people who had been involved in left-wing organizing in the 30s and 40s. Robeson at this point is having difficulty securing venues in which to perform his singing, and there's a number of instances where he's performing somewhere and he speaks to current issues, right? So he becomes really well known as a sort of speaker and singer, right? He would talk about the history of the songs that he was singing. Sometimes he would sing a song in Chinese just for the fun of it because he was fluent in like a dozen languages. And so he brings his conception of the political moment the green light is on. So we get to this moment when there's a lot of drama being drummed up in local communities when Robeson is booked for events because people are trying to curb his freedom of speech and censor what he talks about whenever he performs his music. And this is making it extremely difficult for him to pursue his career. And this is even before Peekskill, the riots there, when he was supposed to perform up in Peekskill, New York, in an outdoor venue in 49. But in 47, he makes this decision that he's going to, again, change focus. And he announces, "I'm retiring here and now from concert work. I shall sing now for my trade union and college friends. In other words, only at gatherings where I can sing what I please." So here again, he's becoming very intentional about the content of his work, and he's, really cutting himself off from what could be a very lucrative concert career in favor of performing in places where he knows that the audience is going to be friendly. Wow, that's really loud. And places where he knows that he's going to be able to speak to the issues of the day as he's performing. So again, he makes this shift in his career that's very intentional, right? But it's really putting principle above payment, right? So he's standing up for the principle of freedom of speech. There were even a couple of places where cases were brought to local courts in order to try to have him perform. But he wants to now be able to perform in like union halls and colleges and places where they're going to not just be supportive, but they're going to understand and connect with the issues that he's talking about, which are primarily segregation, his anti-colonial stand, his continuing anti-fascist stand, and he's taking a stand for peace with the Soviet Union in a time of increasing militarism across the United States. So ultimately, these are not places that can pay him a lot, right? But these are places where he decides to perform because he thinks it's more important to bring these ideas and these messages to the people than essentially make a lot of money, right? So that intentionality really becomes increasingly clear. And I just wanted to note the image here is from a concert that he sang in Peace Arch Park at the Canadian border. So this was sponsored by the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers Union, who were big fans of his. And once his passport was revoked in 1950, he couldn't even cross the Canadian border. In fact, I've seen in the FBI files that they would put a lot of police on the border just in case he was like going to cross the border and they could catch him right away. But so he sings right on the border so that the people in Canada can hear him, and like thousands of people come out for this. But this was the kind of thing that he was doing, again, with the intention of reaching the people more so than necessarily like making a lot of money. And then the last theme I want to talk about is the theme of dignity, which I think is really incredibly important to understanding his artistic career and also his approach to activism. When I was doing research for my book on his 3 portrayals of Shakespeare's Othello, one of the things that I found in researching like hundreds and hundreds of reviews of him playing Othello was that he played Othello with dignity. And so bringing the idea of basic human dignity to the stage in this African character was something at the time that was, really path-breaking. And so this becomes an important part of the way that he carries himself on stage in front of his audiences, but it's also a really important way that he interacts with the people that he's meeting all the time at these concerts and at rallies and at fundraisers, and when he's involved in, political issues. There's so many stories about how people remember him just really acknowledging them as human beings and recognizing their basic human dignity. I've done quite a few book events over the years, and I'm always amazed that people come and they want to tell me the stories of how their grandparents, met Robeson at a union concert, or how, in one case, a really amazing story, a woman's grandfather had defended Robeson at one of the trials whenever he was trying to sing in Albany, New York. And people have so many stories like this, that he made such an impact on them really by being there and having this presence, but also taking the time to recognize people's human dignity. And it was something that he talked about in a lot of his speeches. At the Peace Arch Park, one of those speeches, he points out, I'm up here talking about peace and preserving friendship and dignity for people around the world. It seems like such a simple idea, and yet it was very disruptive in this time of, militarism and viciously divided politics. And I think, we're living through another time of viciously divided politics and militarism. And I feel like, if we could maybe embody some of this, it would really go a long way in terms of just remembering that people that we're dealing with, even on social media, there's a human behind there. Recognize that human being, treat them as a human being, treat them with basic human dignity. One of my favorite stories about Robeson came from the journal Kenyon Review in the 1980s. Don Zachariah told a lot of stories from his life, and one was about Paul Robeson. He grew up in the New York City area, and his parents were left-wing organizers, and they were always having these meetings at the house to raise money for refugees and for war relief and all kinds of things. But as a little kid, he just wanted to be outside playing baseball. And one time when he was 15, he was outside trying to play catch with himself, right, which is not so easy. And the meeting was going on inside the house. Paul Robeson was at this meeting, and Paul Robeson, for whatever reason, noticed him outside trying to play catch with himself. And he goes outside, he reaches out to him, and he starts playing catch with him. And they play catch for a number of minutes. Of course, Paul Robeson is, a tremendous athlete. And, he's trying to show the kid a few moves and stuff. And meanwhile, everyone else at the meeting is kind of looking outside, just what is happening, And after they've played catch for a while, Robeson looks at the ball and he says, wow, this ball is really beat up. And he turns to the people organizing the meeting and he says, can we extend $1.50 from the money raised today to buy a new ball here so that he can play catch? And, obviously it was a story that he never forgot, right? And I love that so much because it shows so much empathy and human compassion and dignity to notice this young boy out there, to reach out to him in this way, and to then have them buy a ball for him, right? Just the human connection that he was able to form with people. Again, it seems incredibly simple, and yet those actions, I think, really just go such a long way. So in conclusion, we're again living through very tumultuous times. And I hope that maybe some of these ideas about Paul Robeson and his life have inspired you to consider how we might approach, the difficulties. And this is not to minimize the difficulties of his time or our time, but just to think about, when we need to find inside of ourselves greater capabilities, we can often reach down deep and do that. And I think, looking to someone like him who lived in difficult times and also, turned in directions of principle rather than in directions of money, because those principles were important and because it was important to treat people with human dignity, is such a great model and example to consider in our times. So thank you for your time today so much. Appreciate it. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has a question.
There's a question from online. John Ozette is asking about the defacing of the mural in Washington, D.C. Do you know about that or anything?
I don't know about that.
Okay. Apparently there was a mural in Washington, D.C. that was defaced.
Of Paul Robeson?
Of Paul Robeson, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So.
I mean, those kind of things do happen kind of cyclically. They definitely come up. There's still a great deal of kind of anti-communist animus against him. I've experienced this giving talks about him. I've been yelled at. I've been called a Stalinist. I've been called lots of names for speaking out about Robeson's life. And I think it really speaks to, again, how much our times have and really haven't changed, from the time that Robeson lived in. And a lot of that animus, both racially and in terms of politics, are still with us, unfortunately. No, not that I know of, not a direct relationship. Robeson's career was sort of on the decline as King's career was kind of on the rise. So they were like traveling in different circles. Robeson did write in his paper Freedom in the 1950s about the Montgomery bus boycott. So he was definitely aware of the nonviolent movement, but it's not something that he was necessarily directly interacting with.
Next, Joyce. Hi. You.
Oh, hello. You mentioned earlier in your research that it was easier to find materials. So I'm wondering, is like Hollywood gonna find this, or have there been like fits and starts of a movie
Good
or
question.
mini series about that?
Yeah, a few years ago, I read that Steve McQueen, the British director, was considering doing a film on Robeson. I think he was also talking about that with Harry Belafonte, who's a big Robeson supporter. Robeson was a big mentor to Belafonte. That I know of, that hasn't started. I would love to help with that project. So if anybody knows him or can reach out to him,
I remember
I'd love to be a part of that.
They were interested in your book too.
Yeah.
She wasn't going to say that, but
I did send some copies of the book to the production company, so we'll see.
yeah, but they never got that. Yeah. Okay, I got you.
I have a question. This was amazing. Thank you. And I love
you.
how you were helping us with the times too. Well, my question for you is, writers, it's really magical when you find the subject and when the subject finds you. How did you guys find each other?
Oh. Now you really want to touch my heart. I remember the exact moment that I encountered Robeson's story. I got Martin Duberman's biography of Robeson, and it totally changed my life. And in reading that, I was just so compelled by his story. And also, I mean, it was right when I started grad school. So it was 2002. And I understood that it was really hard at that time to find much about him other than Duberman's biography. And so it was really at that moment that I decided to do my dissertation on him, and that turned into a few books. But for me, at first, the real connection was Shakespeare, because I'm a big lover of Shakespeare. And his portrayals of Othello just seemed so important and historic, but also I was really captivated by how he fused the political activism together with his Othello performances. So that was really kind of, for me, what drew me in. Thanks for the good question.
So I was really interested in, I didn't realize he was performing at union houses.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that in the post-World War II period, when all the soldiers were off in Europe, many women and African Americans coming up from the South were getting jobs like in Detroit in the auto industry. So I'm just sort of interested in, the union movement
Was not always friendly to
has
African
changed.
Americans.
It's changed. But I
Yeah.
know that you're rightly so. In the first decades of the 20th century, many people forget that socialism was not a dirty word, and trade unionists and socialists were often quite friendly with each other, and even many trade unionists were also socialists. So I just, can you say more about that?
Yeah, there's a big history of that, right? The history of labor in the U.S. is extremely complex, in particular with, their relationship with African Americans, because African Americans weren't always allowed in all of the trade unions. The Communist Party, when they started really organizing, they were actually the one party that was really open to organizing African Americans. And that's one of the reasons why Robeson ends up kind of aligning with a number of those leaders, because, to go back a little bit further, he actually encounters trade unionism more in the time that he's spending in the UK in the 1930s. And it was the miners in Wales who were having a march whenever he was there. And he engaged with the miners and was really interested in their issues, ended up making a film about the miners in Wales and called Proud Valley. And then he kind of brings that interest and knowledge over to the United States, because he's abroad for most of the 1930s, but in the 40s, he's engaging a lot more with those groups. And, he saw trade unionism as a way to potentially bring together people with shared interests, right? So people who are trying to fight segregation, people who are trying to get capitalism either reformed or, kick it out altogether to have a more equitable system in place. And so he worked with people across the spectrum that had, varying degrees of those positions, because his main focus was always anti-fascist and anti-segregation and anti-colonial. And he saw trade unions as a potential ally in those struggles.
I wanted to call back to what seemed to be Robeson's first pivot with the movie, and when he declared that he would be retiring from Hollywood. Did that to you, did that seem like a time of reflection for him, where he decided that that's where he wanted his career to go, towards more fighting the good fight, to say? Or was that something that was kind of always present within him, and this just gave him an opportunity to pursue that?
Oh, what a great question, Vincent. I think both were probably happening, right? Because he had for a long time been hopeful that films would be a pathway to bring issues of African and African-American culture to a greater audience, but it just often wasn't happening. And so this moment was a pivotal moment, because, he decides to kind of stop trying to make film into something that it's not. And the longer part of this speech is that he basically calls out Hollywood for just being interested in money, and that, it's that capitalist structure that was always, bending to Southern politics and saying, we don't really want to be interested in going to see movies with these African-American themes in them, during the era of segregation. And so this became a moment for him to kind of, touch on that while also reflecting on his career. Great question.
Thank you.
Again, thanks for the clarity and sort of going over all these aspects of his career. I was trying to think of someone who would be the Robeson of today, but I don't, or after him. I mean, I just don't see someone who has such a varied skills.
Yeah.
I mean, like, this is an era of specialization, and this guy has like 5 credentials that are all like he excelled at. And
yeah.
I'm thinking, was it all natural? Did he work really hard at all these things?
Both. He had a lot of natural ability, and he also worked at it as well. I think in some of the immediate years, as Robeson's public career is beginning to wane, that's when Harry Belafonte's career was really on the upswing. And he did a lot in the 50s and into the 1960s with trying to bring like Caribbean culture and, the cultures of people of African descent, like to television as a new medium and things like that. And he definitely is somebody who, really looked up to and admired Robeson. I don't know if he is, quite as, multifaceted as Robeson. I will say that I met Belafonte one time when I was giving a talk at an event where he received an honorary degree at Berklee College of Music. And in meeting him, I was asking him to sign my copy of his biography. And I told him I'm a Robeson scholar, and he was like, oh, and like I felt like, wow, we're really connecting. But he was so dear, and like he didn't have to spend those few minutes like actually talking to me, and I was really, really touched by that. And I felt like this must have been what it was like for people who connected with Robeson, because he also had an energy that was like that. He was so just lovely and generous, you know, with people who wanted to interact with him.
And then just follow up, did political office ever of interest, or?
I don't think it was ever of interest to him. He did campaign with Henry A. Wallace when he ran for president on the Progressive Party ticket. And I think he did believe in a lot of the pillars of the Progressive Party platform, because they were like firmly against segregation, and they wanted to pursue diplomacy instead of militancy with the Soviet Union. But I don't think for him personally, it was something that he was interested in.
Right. Yeah, just he's just so talented in all those areas that I just, I don't know who, Belafonte maybe because he's also involved in politics, but just his physical presence,
right?
And
yeah.
That voice, it's just an amazing person.
Absolutely.
Sure.
I forgot to mention the best part, that he was born in New Jersey. He is a son of New Jersey. Princeton was his hometown.
So I had a question. You were saying, was it natural or like nature versus nurture? Like what struck me was the picture in Colombia. So brave. I mean, so
yeah, right.
there seemed to be so many paths along the way where he could have just, given up or gone a different way. Or so what was his family like? Did he have siblings that were also involved, or his parents involved, or was this just a special spark, kind of within him?
Yeah. So in a real nutshell, his father was a minister. His mother unfortunately died when he was very young. He was the youngest of four, and he had a close relationship with his father because the older siblings had kind of gone off to school, and he was often the only one at home. But his father, as a minister, had been outspoken, and he tried to get one of his sons into Princeton Theological Seminary. And that was when Princeton was still rigidly segregated, and that didn't happen. And he also spoke out about issues in the very early 20th century about segregation and disfranchisement. And it was made clear to him that he should probably get out of the area. And so young Paul and his father ended up kind of moving around a few times, as his father really then sort of struggled to look for work. But his father was one of his biggest influences, because that was where he had the sort of support of the African American church. That was where he learned the music of the African American church. There were times when he went to schools that were all white, and he would be the only African American as a young man. And so he learned to kind of, navigate these different communities, right? And that, I think, gave him a great deal of maturity that, a lot of young people might not have. And his father really recognized his talent academically and really nurtured that and encouraged that as well. So I think a lot of that influence came from his father.
So I want to say something, because I work with Doc a lot, Lindsey. And when we went to Princeton, we met the little lady who was at the
Peekskill riots.
Right. She was the first one there on a rainy day. And she said she still had the scar from when she got hit with a bottle they threw at the bus. But as an actor, I want to say, well, first of all, I'm a South Jersey boy. They didn't teach us about Paul Robeson here in New Jersey. So I know more about Paul Robeson and African-American history being Lindsey's partner than I did in school. But I just want to underline how amazing it is, because your question is great, that someone when he was in the acting at the top of his peak, he walked away. You can't get people to speak out these days because of cancel culture and all this other stuff. But basically, to walk away when you're at the top of your profession, especially acting, and turn away is what the thing that sticks with me the most. And that lady being there when we, she was the first one there on a rainy day. And she, she's very, much older and stuff. And as a performer, I can tell you, it's hard to be able to stick to, to walk the walk. A lot of people can talk it, but to walk it, especially when it hits you in your pockets. And I think that's the reason why Paul ages so well, his story. And I also believe, my little opinion, that's the reason why his story hasn't been told as much, because it's extremely powerful.
That's
You know what I
right.
mean? Because she's giving you a very short version of this, because as you can see the question, there's so much more. But that's whether he was a talent, a natural at all the things he does. Obviously he was, but even to be just a singer and to walk away when you're at the peak, you can't find people to do that. It's hard to do that, and that's what inspires me. Really, because as a comedian, I decided not to do some things, and you don't make money, but it ages well. You know what I mean? And it's very special that you guys are out here tonight.
Thank you.
I did that thing that I do, which I looked up Paul Robeson in the Jersey Journal historically, and he appeared at Snyder High School in 1946.
Oh.
And then in May, and then and they had a nice article about it, and some pictures.
Nice.
Singing in 6 languages, and then on May 31st, 1946. The editorial page says, "Oh, well, it was propaganda mixed with music," and they use the word pink.
Right, exactly. That was how fast the shift could happen. Yeah, very dramatic. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming out today. Please stay and enjoy some refreshments and
buy a book.
Thank you.
Thank you.